The British planned to blow up Mount Etna in 1941. British intelligence agencies developed Operation Chaos, a plan to blow up Mount Etna to simulate an eruption and cause panic among Italian troops. The idea was abandoned due to the risk of unpredictable consequences. Part 1. A hellish idea. London, in 1941, was a frontline city. The air was thick with the smell of recent fires, soot, and a cold fog creeping in from the Thames. In the basement of one of the nondescript buildings on the Victoria Embankment, beyond the reach of even the sirens, a unique atmosphere reigned. A tense silence broken only by the rustling of papers and the steady ticking of a wall clock. Here, in the inner sanctum of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, the most insane and desperate war plans were hatched. Two men sat at a table littered with maps of Sicily and geological reports. Colonel Archibald Hampshire, a gaunt man with graying temples and a look more accustomed to parades than clandestine operations, and Professor Edgar Lowell, a volcanologist from Cambridge, whose rumpled jacket and absent-minded demeanor contrasted sharply with the impeccable military bearing. "So, Professor?" Hampshire put down his glasses and stared at the scientist. "Enlighten me, how realistic is this idea?" Lowell, who was busily sketching a diagram of a magma chamber on a piece of paper, winced and looked up. His gaze was lively, full of that strange spark that lights up a scientist's eyes when the subject of his passion is discussed. Realistic, Colonel. A matter of terminology. From a physical standpoint, more than that, Etna isn't just a mountain. It's a gigantic valve under which colossal pressure exists. We estimate that a huge amount of gases have accumulated in its vent and lateral fissures. If we were, say, to plant a series of powerful charges at strategic points at a certain depth. He became interested again, pointing his pencil at his drawing. You see, that could upset the delicate balance. We don't create energy, we release it, like a match touched to gasoline vapors. In other words, we can force it to erupt, Hampshire clarified, barely concealing his skepticism. Not force it, Colonel, Lowell corrected. More like nudge it, simulate the start of an eruption. Trigger a release of ash, gases, perhaps lava. The scale is impossible to predict. It could be a powerful but localized explosion or, he paused, looking the military man in the eye. It could trigger a process we won't be able to stop. Hampshire leaned back in his chair. The idea proposed by one of his young, overly creative officers initially struck him as crazy. Blow up a volcano? It sounded like the plot of a Jules Verne novel, but the more he thought about it, the less crazy it seemed. The war had reached a stalemate. Britain stood alone against the entire might of the Axis. North Africa hung by a thread. The USSR was desperately resisting. Something was needed that could shake up the entire Mediterranean theater and knock out Italy, Hitler's ally. Imagine, morning awakens in Sicily. The sky, usually clear and blue, is covered in a black poisonous shroud. Streams of molten lava pour down from Mount Etna, that eternal, almost divine symbol of the island. The earth trembles. The air fills with a deafening roar and the suffocating smell of sulfur. Panic. What is this? Revenge of the gods? Punishment for the war? The Italian divisions stationed at the foot of the volcano are abandoning their positions. Desertions are rampant. The ports of Messina and Catania are paralyzed. The Allied invasion is open. One daring, albeit risky, operation could change the balance of power in the region. Let's say, the colonel said slowly. How can this be technically accomplished? Lowell perked up. He pulled out new sheets of paper and began drawing diagrams of explosive placement. They needed not just to plant bombs, but to find the volcano's weak spots, fumaroles, lateral fissures, areas of least resistance in the rock. They needed mountaineering saboteurs familiar with Etna's terrain, and tons of highly powerful explosives, which had to be delivered to the slopes. Evading Italian patrols and the watchful carabinieri. Risks, Professor? Hampshire interrupted. You said yourself. Unpredictable. Lowell fell silent. His enthusiasm instantly faded, replaced by an expression of deep concern. Risks. Colonel, we're playing with forces humanity has never controlled. We could trigger not just a localized explosion, but a planetary catastrophe, an eruption that would blanket not only Sicily, but also southern Italy in ash. Sulfur emissions into the stratosphere could change the climate for years. We could destroy dozens, if not hundreds, of villages that have existed on these slopes for centuries. We don't know how the entire tectonic system of the region will react. It's like waking a sleeping giant not knowing whether he'll awaken hungover or enraged. Hampshire stood silently and went to the window. Outside, gray, dank London lay before us, a city that had endured the bombings but could collapse in despair. A turning point was needed. A victory was needed, at any cost. He turned to Lowell. Work out the details. A full report. All the pros and cons, all the risks. We'll present it to the committee next week. The code name for the operation— He paused for a moment, looking at the chaos on the table. Operation Chaos. A perfectly appropriate name. Professor Lowell nodded, rolled up his blueprints, and left. He walked through the corridors of the SOE, feeling a heavy weight in his soul. On the one hand, a chance to help his country, to apply his knowledge to real-world action. On the other, the responsibility of possibly becoming the architect of an apocalypse comparable to the most destructive forces of war. The hellish idea had been put into production. Part 2. Shadows on the Slopes of the Gods, Sicily, Autumn 1941. The air here was thick and sweet, smelling of volcanic dust, sea, and ripe oranges. For Lieutenant Jack Morris, abandoned by submarine a week earlier, this scent was a constant reminder of how far he was from home, from the misty fields of Kent and the smell of wet asphalt. He lay in cover among the solidified black lava flows called Sciarra, and through binoculars watched the Serpentine, road leading to one of Etna's side craters. Jack wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense, but a geologist and experienced mountaineer. He had been selected for preliminary reconnaissance as part of a crazy plan that still seemed like a dream to him. His task was to verify Lowell's data, find specific locations for planting charges, assess security, and the possibility of a covert approach. Etna towered above him, menacing and majestic. Its snow-capped peak glowed pink in the rays of the setting sun, and a thin wisp of white smoke rose from its main crater. It was alive. It was breathing. And he, a man of science, had been ordered to try to wound it, to provoke it into rage. With him was a guide, Salvatore, a local shepherd, a thin and silent old man with skin like cracked volcanic rock. Salvatore didn't ask unnecessary questions. He knew the two Englishmen were saboteurs, but they had fought the fascists, and the fascists had taken his son's boat and sent him off somewhere in Africa, from where there was no news. That was enough. There, Salvatore pointed a gnarled finger toward the narrow gorge, is the Bocca Nuova, a new mouth. The mountain spits out rocks and ash, but there's a trail. There are guards, but they're lazy. They sit in a hut smoking. They patrol twice a day. Jack nodded, making notes in his field journal. He wasn't thinking about the Italian soldiers, but about the volcano itself. Professor Lowell was right. This mountain wasn't a monolith. It was a complex system of channels, chambers, and valves. Planting a charge anywhere would be useless. They needed to find a point where a blow would trigger a chain reaction, like finding a weak spot in a giant's armor. That night they climbed higher. The moonless night was their ally. A cold wind swept the slopes, howling in the crevices. Jack, despite his warm jacket, shivered. Not just from the cold, from the realization of what he was doing. He recalled the faces of the professors at Cambridge, their debates about tectonics and magmatic plumes. All of this had been pure, lofty science. And now he, their student, was crawling up the slope of Europe's most active volcano with a compass, a seismograph, and plastic explosive charges for test explosions to measure the rock's response. "She sees everything," Salvatore said suddenly, breaking the long silence. His voice was like the creaking of old wood. "Who?" Jack asked, breaking away from his thoughts. "Mount Etna. We call it Mongebello. The mountain of mountains. She's been here a long time. She's seen the Romans. She's seen the Arabs. She's seen the Normans. They all come and go. but she remains. She doesn't like to be disturbed. There was no superstition in his words, merely a statement of fact. Jack looked again at the dark cone silhouetted against the star-studded sky. He felt her presence physically, as if he were on the back of a sleeping dragon. What if Salvatore was right? What if their intervention was the final straw? He imagined not a controlled explosion, but an awakening. A split in the slope, rivers of fire flowing into the valleys, burning the vineyards and villages he'd seen during the day. The cities of Catania, Taormina. He saw the faces of the people in these villages. They weren't enemies. They were just like Salvatore, ordinary people caught in the whirlwind of war. They spent 3 days on the slopes. Jack collected rock samples and took measurements. Every night he radioed London, transmitting encrypted reports. The replies were brief. Continue. Check coordinates. Assess avalanche risks. During one of the communication sessions, a new alarming message arrived. Italian intelligence may be aware of increased interest in the region. Patrol activity has increased. Speed up work. Prepare a landing point for the main group. The war was making itself felt. This wasn't some abstract game played in London offices. It was a real threat. Jack and Salvatore were forced to change camp, moving even higher, into wilder and more dangerous areas. One day they nearly encountered a patrol of Alpini. Jack saw them through binoculars, young, tanned faces, walking easily, as if they were at home. On the last night, before descending to the evacuation point on the coast, Jack stood on the edge of one of the small craters. He threw a stone into it and listened for a long time as it rolled with a dull thud into the darkness. He imagined that at the bottom lay not stone, but tons of explosives. He imagined the roar, the tremor, the first ejection of rocks and ash. He imagined the panic below, and in that moment, he understood. He understood what they had perhaps already understood in London, but were afraid to admit. They couldn't do it. Not because it was technically impossible, but because the consequences went far beyond military necessity. They wouldn't simply cause panic among the Italian troops. They would unleash a force they couldn't control. A force that wouldn't distinguish between friend and foe, soldiers and women, old people and children. They would become not soldiers fighting the enemy, but gods, unleashing wrath upon the entire land. And the price of such a victory would be too terrible. He sent his final report to London. It contained all the technical data, coordinates, and security assessments. But at the end, breaking all instructions, he added a personal, unencrypted phrase. The price of awakening the dragon may be equal to the price of its victory.
Part 3. The burden of decision running to London in early 1942. Jack Morris was struck by how much had changed and yet remained the same. The city still stood, but the scars of the bombing were everywhere. The war had become global. The United States had entered the conflict, and the Battle of Moscow was raging on the Eastern Front. The context in which Operation Chaos had been born no longer seemed so desperate. He was summoned to a debriefing in that very basement on the Victoria Embankment. The same people were seated at the table, Colonel Hampshire, Professor Lowell, but new faces had appeared as well, high-ranking officials from the Admiralty and the Foreign Office. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Hampshire summarized Jack's intelligence findings. Newly annotated maps of Sicily lay before each of them. Lowell, looking tired but collected, presented an updated geological analysis. Lieutenant Morris's data confirms the main hypothesis, the professor said. Points for effective detonation exist. However, updated seismic activity measurements show that the Etna system is even more unstable than we assumed. A controlled detonation with predictable consequences is unlikely. The probability of a catastrophic eruption, according to my new calculations, increases to 35 to 40%. We could trigger not a simulation, but a cataclysm. The figure hung in the air. 40% chance of destroying part of Sicily and unpredictable climatic consequences. What would be the military dividends in a successful scenario? Asked the Admiral, a dry and practical man. Panic, disorganization of the rear, possible port incapacitation for weeks, even months, Hampshire replied. This could be the ideal precondition for a major amphibious operation, hypothetically. And if it fails? A diplomat in an impeccable suit intervened. Imagine the headlines in neutral newspapers. Britain uses volcano as weapon of mass destruction. Thousands of civilians die in fire started by surmise. We'll provide Mussolini and Hitler with the perfect propaganda tool. They'll appear as defenders of Europe from barbaric islanders. The U.S. might reconsider its aid policy. The consequences for our moral authority would be catastrophic. Jack listened. Sitting in the corner, he looked at these men weighing human lives on the invisible scales of strategy and policy. He remembered Salvador's face, the scent of orange groves, the warm stone of the slopes. This wasn't some abstract enemy territory. This was land where people lived, loved, and died. There's another aspect, Lowell said quietly. All eyes turned to him. Scientific, ethical. We scientists spend our lives studying nature to understand it and, perhaps, protect ourselves from its wrath. If we use this knowledge to cause harm, if we become not guardians but arsonists, we will cross a line from which there will be no turning back. The war will end, but this precedent will remain. What will prevent someone else from trying to cause an earthquake or a tsunami in the future? Colonel Hampshire remained silent. He had been the operation's main proponent. He saw it as a brilliant move, capable of turning the tide of the war in the South. But now, having heard all the pros and cons, he saw the whole picture. It was too great a risk, too much at stake. And it wasn't just the volcano's unpredictability, but the unpredictability of the world's reaction. Lieutenant Morris, Hampshire suddenly addressed him. You were there? What's your opinion, as someone who saw it with your own eyes? Jack stood up. His voice was firm, though his insides were clenched. Sir, I am a soldier. I follow orders. But what I saw, Etna is not a target. It is part of the world. A world we claim to be trying to save, destroying part of it to save another. It's questionable arithmetic. Will the Italian soldiers flee? Perhaps. But we will also kill thousands of those whose freedom we fight for. We will become not liberators, but punishers. And this fire will burn not only on the slopes of Etna, but on our conscience, forever. Asterisk silence fell in the room. The diplomat nodded. The admiral scribbled something thoughtfully on a piece of paper. Professor Lowell looked at Jack with gratitude. Hampshire rose slowly. I believe we've exhausted the matter, he said formally. The risks of Operation Chaos far outweigh the potential tactical benefits. I recommend the committee abandon any further development of the plan and destroy all materials. The decision was made. The infernal machine, so carefully designed, was dismantled from the drawing boards before it had even been born. A few days later, Jack Morris received a new assignment. He was being transferred to North Africa, to the regular forces. Before leaving, he stopped by Professor Lowell's office. Lowell was sitting by the window, looking out at the gray London sky. You made the right choice there, on the mountain, Lowell said without turning around. Not only as a soldier, but as a man. What if we were wrong? Jack asked quietly. What if that explosion could have saved more lives, hastening the end of the war? We'll never know, the professor replied. But there are things we do know. We know we didn't become monsters. We know we didn't accept fate. Sometimes the greatest victories are not the ones you win, but the disasters you avoid. Jack stepped outside. A light rain fell. He inhaled the London air, the scent of wet asphalt, coal smoke, and hope. They hadn't awakened the dragon. The war continued. It was long and terrible. But that day he realized there are limits that must not be crossed, even for the sake of victory. And Britain's realization of this was a quiet, unrecorded, but no less important victory.